Hello everyone, welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. Today we have the privilege of hosting Professor Stephan Meier, Chair of the Management Division at the James P. Gorman Professor of Business at Columbia Business School. In this episode, Professor Stephan offers an in-depth look into his forthcoming book, The Employee Advantage: How Putting Workers First Helps Business Thrive. Professor Stephan, a cordial welcome to this podcast episode. It's an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Deepak. The honor is on my side.
Yeah. Professor Stephan, can you start by giving us a brief overview of your book, The Employee Advantage, and what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. Thank you so much, Deepak. As the title of the book says, this is about how to create a competitive advantage by treating your employees well. So the book is really about the why and the how of putting employees first in order to create a competitive advantage. It's a book that I think is valuable for any type of leaders, whether you're the CEO of a large organization or an emerging leader who just has a team of a couple of people to manage. So one theme that goes through the whole book is that employees are the new customers. Now, what does that mean? I think that has at least two implications that I describe in the book. One is kind of the same themes that led to customer centricity. Before customer centricity, there was product centricity, and then we shifted, or at least the successful companies shifted to putting customers first. And there are certain trends that led to that. And I argue in the book that the same trends are also hitting the labor market, are kind of shifting power somehow to the employees. And the second implications of employees are the new customers. We need to deeply understand, as we did with customers, what really affects the experience, and not of the customers, but of the employees, so to speak. When you think about customer centricity, this is not about lowering the price, even though customers, of course, like low prices. Customer centricity are increasing the customer experience, and as a result, you can actually increase the price in competition. And the same, I argue, is going to be true for the employees. It's not just increasing the wage, it's actually improving the employee experience, and as a result, the cost per unit might actually go down. So the cost might actually go down because productivity increases, innovation goes up, turnover goes down, and so on and so forth. So in the book, I really provide a roadmap of how to gain this competitive advantage. It's backed by a lot of empirical research and illustrated with a lot of case studies about this, what really motivates humans, how to humanize work in order to increase and get the employee advantage, and how to use technology in order to enhance the experience. Now, what inspired me to write a book, this particular book? I'm a behavioral economist by training. So I study human motivation my whole career. And at the same time, I'm teaching hundreds of MBA students and executives about business strategy. And so I kind of brought those two fields together to think about the human side of strategy and the implications for the future of work. So I really try to understand, because I do think it's a truth that, organizations tick because of their people, and we need to really understand what makes the humans tick, what makes them work. And then we think about the strategic implications and the implications for the future of work. So that's really what is in the book. That's kind of the goal of the book, to create kind of this human-centric future of work, so to speak.
Very insightful, Professor Stephan. One of the core premises of your book is the idea that prioritizing employees can lead to business success. So could you elaborate on how this approach contrasts with more traditional business models?
Absolutely. It's interesting. So when you ask executives, and I've never heard an executive or a leader not say their employees are the most important assets. Everybody would say, well, we care a lot about our employees. I mean, they're like, of course, really important, so to speak. Well, so I actually looked, in my research, I thought like, okay, let's check whether employees are really the most important asset. So I looked at thousands and thousands of transcripts of like earning calls, 10K, communications of organizations. Turns out employees are not the most important aspect. In fact, when you compare them to customers, they talk about customers at least 10 times more than employees. And when you do text analysis of how they actually talk about employees, employees are kind of cost, risk, and customers are like opportunities and growth and excitement. So that is the first indicator is, well, maybe something is not exactly that we put our employees first. The second, probably more frustrating and probably more depressing fact is if you look at engagement levels, a lot of people, employees, are very, very disengaged. So if you believe kind of the Gallup engagement index, in the US, there is roughly like 65% of employees are disengaged. Worldwide, it's even higher. It's like 85% of employees are not fully engaged at work. So something is not exactly going right in terms of how to treat employees right. So what I argue in the book is that we need at least two mindset shifts, or leaders or organizations need at least two mindset shifts. The first one is moving from an either-or thinking to win-win. Often when organizations and leaders think about the workforce and also treating them better, it's kind of, well, we can either treat them well, but that kind of, hits the bottom line and is not so good for shareholders. So that's kind of either or. And I'm arguing in the book that you can actually think about it as win-win. Again, the analogy to customers, if you think about customers, it's like treating your customers well is not coming out of your bottom line. In fact, it's like win-win. You treat them well. Think Amazon, they're super happy, and you're making a killing. And you're investing a lot in the experience of the customer, and I'm going to argue it's the same with employees. So we have to move from either or to this win-win when we think about employees. So employees win and the organizations actually is thriving as well. The second mindset shift is moving away from thinking what actually motivates employees. And there is this misperception, I think, or often this misperception, jobs kind of suck, nobody really wants to work. And the only reason they do is either they get controlled or they get money, monetary incentive. And we have to move away from work is actually much more, and people are motivated by much more than money. There is Okay, so it's those two mindset shift that really is like, either from either or to win-win, and from thinking about people are only motivated by money. And that's kind of, I think, very different from how many organizations are actually run these days. And I see that and discuss that all the time with my executives in my programs that I run, or with leaders around the world that I talk to.
Professor, what are some of the key strategies or practices that companies can adopt to truly put their employees first?
Yeah, interesting. So I think one of the main strategies that kind of go through all the different approaches how to put employees first is to empower them. That means, involving them in decisions and giving them enough autonomy, the necessary trust, and collect enough feedback from them and provide them with feedback for them to be successful. So think about feedback for a second. If you would go to a marketing executive and tell them, do you think it's a good idea to ask your customers once a year how they're doing? They would all laugh. They were like, of course not. We need like constant feedback, how they're doing. Then we can adjust, we can get better and like whatever. With employees, we kind of asking them if once a year. Most organizations have those annual employee feedback forms. They often ignore the insight that come out. The employee know that, so they're frustrated. So actually the completion rate is really low. And we definitely have to change that. We have to think about, what really collecting trusting the employees that they have a lot of information themselves. And throughout the book, in almost every approach, empowering them and kind of shifting some of the power to their employees, it's going to be a critically important aspect. The other thing that is, I think, a really important insight is, not everybody is the same. People are very different. And again, we know that in customers. We know that. I mean, the best employee-centric organizations, think Netflix, Amazon, whatever. They know exactly what I want to see, what I want to hear, or at least they're getting a good sense. And then they personalize the experience to what I'm doing. Because I'm different from you. I'm different from my wife. I'm different from my kids, obviously. And so I have 3 kids, the 5 in our household. They're very different. And they have the same login to Netflix, different profile, and it's a completely different set of what they're getting. Now, in the workplace, we're actually doing a lot of one size fits all, but that's just not enough anymore. So we have to figure out kind of how to empower them and how to personalize the experience to understand, and understanding obviously what makes people tick, but then understand like what makes you tick and what makes me tick, and then personalize this experience going forward.
Can you share any compelling case studies or examples from your book where companies have successfully implemented these employee-first strategies and see positive outcomes?
Yeah, of course. I mean, they are, on one hand, I've shared before that there is a lot of disengagement and, a lot of companies are actually not putting their employees first. On the other hand, there are also shining examples of people, of leaders, organizations who are actually doing it well. And throughout the book, I talk a lot about those as well and kind of learning from those case studies. So let me ask you a question. Did you know which company was the best company to work for in the world in 2021 and 22? Now, you might think like Google, other tech companies, NVIDIA, whatever. No, it actually was DHL Express. So now, not exactly the workplace and the job you would imagine topping kind of the great places to work list. But what they did is actually they heavily invested in thinking about what actually makes their employees tick. They listened to their feedback. They celebrated their successes. They completely overhauled their learning and development programs so that both for frontline workers and for managers to create a very inclusive, very supportive work environment that allows people in the organization also to have the right skills and to learn and to grow in the organization. So yes, they not only raised in the ranking of the best places to work, as a company is actually very successful financially. So it's not either or. They actually were able to achieve both. Okay, another interesting example is Buurtzorg. This is the largest home care provider in the Netherlands. So what they're doing, maybe not surprisingly, they go to people's home and provide the care there. The interesting part about this organization is they get about a 30% higher client satisfaction rate than their competitors and have substantially lower absenteeism, overhead, turnover, required hours of end. It's about 1/3 to 2/3 lower than what the competition is. So they're doing it better to a fraction of the cost. How do they do this? They do this by tapping into a very core motivation of humans, which is autonomy and trust. So they're all organized around very independent roughly 12 nurses teams who have complete autonomy, not only about what they're doing in their care, but also hiring, everything they do. The overhead, the headquarters is just to coach and like to help if something doesn't work. So they're extremely autonomous. Now they complement this, which is an important part. They complement this with a lot of technology to give enough feedback, because autonomy in itself doesn't often work. It only works if somebody is engaged, gives feedback. If I tell you, okay, Deepak, you're now in charge of whatever, X, Y, and Z, I need to give you feedback. Are you on track? Like, is it going well? And you actually, as the leader, you need to more engaged, not to control, not as a micromanager, but actually set it up for success. So what Buurtzorg is doing is giving that autonomy, complementing it with a lot of IT and information systems that give those teams the right feedback, the right information for them to do better. So not to control, but actually to support the autonomy. And it really works like a charm, like better service, fraction of the cost. There are many other examples of companies that do either part or all of it well. Costco in the US, I talk a lot about Best Buy in the US, Haier in China. So there are also like a lot of international companies that I talk about that actually do get it right, at least part of it.
Yeah. For businesses looking to adopt an employee-first approach, what are some practical steps they can take to begin this transformation?
Yeah. Very, very good question. In the end, and I'm saying that throughout the book, it's not easy. It's hard. Now, what is easy and might be the first step is if you think about what are the tools that we use for customers, and then using the same tools for employees. So I have an interesting example that I talk about in the book, which is Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company. They were dealing with a lot of issues on diversity. They had huge diversity efforts to make sure that in the C-suites there are more women or people of color. But somehow it didn't work. The traditional ways didn't really work. So they were like struggling. So what should we do and whatever? And then one of the people had like this brilliant idea. What do we do with our customers? And it's like, well, we have like whole teams who does like customer journeys, figure out like what moments that matter for the customers and whatever. And they said like, well, let's take that marketing team and just do not customer, but employee journeys. So they interviewed, got a lot of data, and figured out, what is the journey of one of our employees? What are the moments that really matter? I mean, these are now all marketing terms. What are moments that matter for the particular employees? And so they got insights about like what actually matters and what are roadblocks that they've never thought about before. And then they completely changed how they thought about the experience of their employees. And as a result, the percentage of women in management increases from 2016 to 2020, by 5 percentage points. It was so successful that they now took this approach and do it for other segments in the organization, figure out like, what about Latino workers and so on and so forth. So there are many, many other tools from customer centricity that you now can start thinking about, okay, feedback. How do we get constant feedback? What do we do with the feedback with customers and so on? And then kind of reusing those for the employees. And I think that's a good first step, which is we already have the tools. Most organizations who are customer centric have the tools in place already, and they're just reusing those.
Yeah. What role does leadership play in fostering a work environment that prioritizes employee well-being and satisfaction?
Yeah. I mean, leaders are critically important for almost everything, but I think they're critically important here as well. And they're important from both the C-suite to kind of the middle managers and below. Because we know from study after study, that what really matters are actually managers. There is very few people who leave jobs. Most people leave bosses. The bosses are terrible. They manage it terribly and whatever. And so we really need to think about, how to do from on all levels. So there is an interesting example of a CEO that I talk about. That is Hubert Joly. So he was the CEO of Best Buy. Best Buy, for those who don't know, it's a US retail chain who sells electronics. Now, if you think about it, it's not particular, in fact, many of those retailers went out of business because Amazon kicked their butts. And so Hubert Joly comes in and has to do a complete turnaround of that organization in order to actually save it, because all the others, Radio Shack and Circus City and all those other competitors went out of business already. And what he did is not and he got a lot of advice of you just have to fire a bunch of people. I mean, you have to cut costs and whatever. And what he said, no, actually what I need to do is being very employee centric, because customers come in because they got a good experience there. And you can only get a good experience if the employees are really happy. So you made a turnaround that is very, very employee-centric and saved the company as a result. And there are a lot of steps, a lot of things that I talk about in the book. But it's not just the CEOs. It's even those who cannot set the wage, who cannot set the vacation policies, who not can set anything of that. So there was an interesting experiment that I describe in the book as well. It was done in Turkey, and they were about 2,000 or something middle managers, and they put about half of them into a program where they just taught them about how to communicate with employees, how to be very humane language and how to treat them with respect, and so on. And the effects were incredibly positive. They had job satisfaction increased, motivation increased, turnover dropped significantly. The proportion of subordinates who said that their manager don't have enough support dropped by 41%. As a result, interesting enough, if they then ask them, do you want to come back to the office? Hybrid work and return to office is a big deal. The percentage who wanted to come to the office actually increased by 6 percentage points. Because if the work environment is not toxic, then if the work environment is toxic, I would rather work at home and be on Zoom. And those are not people who can set any HR policies. Those are just leaders who manage their team. So I think we have to be extremely intentional about the leadership style on any level. And that then creates this intentional workplace is really human first. And so I mean, this is now selfishly speaking, I encourage every leader, or even leaders who can give books to their team, every leader of a small team to kind of read the book to understand what really motivates employees, what might motivate my team, and what kind of practical steps can I do to improve going forward.
Yeah. So, Professor Stephan, what are some of the common challenges or misconceptions businesses might face, when they're trying to put their employees first, and how can they overcome them?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, one of the real challenges, I think, is, as I mentioned before, a big step of being employee-centric is empowering employees. Now, the flip side of empowering employees is you have to give up power and you have to trust your employees. This is really, really hard to do, because we're in a lot of traditional organizations, we're used for command and control. I tell you what to do, I have control over it. I mean, I'm personally a little bit of a control freak myself in my personality. It's not so easy for me to give up control. But that's the only way of actually creating this employee advantage. Now, there is with that and others, there are a couple of misconceptions. And one I already mentioned before. When we think about giving up some of the power, a lot of leaders think we have to now not engage as much. They think like, oh, you're now in charge, so I'm stepping back. While like the traditional approach, like, the much hated micromanager is like, I'm always in your face in order to make sure that you're working, and I'm always controlling and whatever. So they think, oh, when I'm like give autonomy, I have to step back. That's not true. In fact, in order to set up autonomy and empowerment, you have to engage more. Not engaging for control, but in order to engage, in order to make this autonomy successful. Because the problem with not engaging is that all the interactions then happen when something goes wrong, which it will. Like if you autonomy, you're going to run and do stuff. And eventually, something is not exactly aligned with how I thought it should be, or like something goes wrong. And then all the interaction we're having are negative. It's like stuff that didn't work. And so leaders have to be what I call like engaged coaches. They have to empower, but being more engaged in order to create, to set this autonomy up for success. Another misconception, I think, about this employees first approach is employees are always right. Employees are not always right. As also now customers are not always right, even if we're customer centric. So we have to think really critically about leadership is still important, and guidance is still important. Employee centricity putting workers first does not mean they can do whatever they want and everything they say is going to be right. But you're taking in this feedback and, figuring out kind of they should be in the center somehow, but employees, are sometimes wrong. Now, of course, I also talk about it. The more information we share with them, the more transparent we are, which we should be. What's the strategy of the organization? Why do I do X, Y, and Z? The more they actually understand our partners, instead of thinking, oh, I want this. And then they figure out, like, actually, that doesn't really work in our organization. So the two misconceptions is like, if you empower them, you have to step back. No, if you empower them, you have to engage more. And employees are not always right. I mean, there is still strategy and leadership that has to be on top. And same with customers. Customers are not always right, even in a customer-centric organization.
So how can businesses measure the impact of their employee-first initiatives on overall performance and profitability?
Yeah, that's interesting and super important. I mean, metrics are critical in I think everything we do. Now, it becomes much harder if the benefit of an investment, and here, like investing in your employees, comes delayed, comes in the future. I mean, that's true also with employee centricity, like measuring the impact on like employee centricity or in customer centricity or customer experience is also really difficult. Now, just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, obviously. So I think we should start collecting outputs, kind of starting from the employee, but then going broader because, I mean, while we might care that employees are happy, that's not the ultimate outcome. We actually want, yes, them to be happy, but like the organization to benefit as a result as well. So I personally would start, like all job satisfaction, engagement, turnover, constant feedback on the employees. That's like on the employees level, and see whether we can actually move that lever. Sometimes outside organizations, evaluate kind of how good the workplace is. But in the end, this is only a means to an end, which is an organizational level. What is actually the innovation output? What is the productivity level? And finally, what's the profitability of it? Now, there is obviously more in an organizations that affect profitability. If I'm also not saying if you just focus on our employee, forget about your go-to-market strategy and forget about customers. Of course not. You can have a terrible business model, really employee-centric and not making any money. I mean, that's also not the way to do. You have to think about all those different stakeholders, customers being one, competitors others, shareholders, whatever. Employees are a really important one as well. So that's what I argue as well. So you kind of start from the employee experience, and that's what you probably can measure the impact first. And then it's going to go, broader in like, how does that affect the innovation capability, the productivity, the customer experience, and then eventually the profitability as a result.
In your research, have you found that prioritizing employees also has a broader social and community benefits?
Yeah. I mean, work is one of the most important activities most people do. When you look at how much time we spend at work, taking out sleep, most people spend a lot of time at work, and work is really critical to people's identity, the meaning they're getting. It's an important part of it. And if jobs suck, if people are miserable at it, this is not only affecting those individuals, but affecting, their friends, their family, their community as a result. And there is a very powerful but kind of sad book by Angus Deaton and I'm blanking on her name. The Nobel Prize winner. So it's called Death of Despair. It's like that. It actually leads bad jobs might actually also lead to, suicide, drug abuse. If we have decent jobs, I argue in the book that it helps organizations, but I do think it also creates benefits for society because it has, humane and decent jobs are critically important for humans and humans around, for the individual, but also everybody around that. Yeah. So I do think that it is critically important to create decent and good jobs. I argue because of the organization, but I think there are other benefits of it that go way beyond the company, the organization at the bottom line of those companies.
Fantastic insights, Professor Stephan. Thank you so much. How do you see the future of work evolving, especially in the context of employee-first business models?
Yeah, that's interesting. When we think about the future of work, or like, how technology kind of affects work, this is, of course, top of mind at the moment of a lot of people. How does AI or generative AI affect work? How does it affect the workforce and skills? How does it affect the workplace? Where we do work. Now, it's actually a big focus in my book as well. So throughout, I kind of talk about technology a lot. I do think we did in general kind of a little over-indexed on technology and forgot that, humans are actually at the center of the organizations. And I kind of want to bring the focus back. It's like, it's good to think about technology, but like in the end, in this human machine interaction, there is the human part as well. Or like this, as I sometimes said, that very old technology called the human brain. And we kind of need to understand that old technology as well. I write a case about it. I write about him in the book. He's the head of AI at Morgan Stanley, and Jeff McMillan. And he said once, I couldn't agree more, tech is easy, humans are hard. So I want to, in this future of work, think about the humans a lot. Now, the really important part, and when we think about the future, is like, it's up to the leaders to decide. We often have this feeling of, or I often hear the sentiment, like, technology is hitting us and like we can just react. And it's like, No, we can actually be active. We have to be active in how to employ it. Now, technology can, when we think about human motivation, can on one hand really enhance it, and on the other hand, completely destroy it. So think about, autonomy as like one of the, I talk about 4 motivators in the book, autonomy being one of them. Now, and that it's trust. So I call it the matter of trust, because autonomy, the flip side is like you have to trust. Now, technology can completely destroy that trust. When you look at remote work technology, or like those surveillance technology or bossware that a lot of companies install on people's laptops or computers, I mean, that just completely destroys the underlying trust and the motivation as a result. But on the other hand, we can also think about, no, technology can actually enhance a lot of the motivators. It can actually create more purposeful work by like getting rid of all the stupid tasks that nobody wants to do. So it can augment the human as well. Or if you think about autonomy as well, instead of like deploying technology to surveil because I don't trust my employees to be productive, I can use it to give them feedback, to be an engaged coach, to actually use the technology as a result. Or I talk about like one other important motivator is what I call working together works. It's kind of the interpersonal relationship. And I think technology can help a lot in like understanding, either mapping who is actually talking to each other, like figuring out who has the right connection, who should have, and also support people in being better communicators. When you think about generative AI, I mean, I often think about like if every leader had like a generative AI coach, we will get rid of a lot of shitty emails, a lot of shitty like communication, would actually help people to be better leaders as a result. So I think the future could look very, very promising if we deploy technology and thinking about the human-centric future of work instead of like destroying kind of motivation in the going.
What were some surprising findings or insights you discovered while writing this book?
Yeah, on the one hand, I'm a very optimistic and very positive person in general. So I was a little shocked to see how badly we're actually doing in putting employee first. So, because again, like everybody have never seen an executive or a leader who doesn't think like I care about my team. But they're doing a pretty bad job in putting their employees first. And that I'm not even sure that's like because they're not well intended. But it's like, they might not completely understand what motivates their employees, and it's very difficult to then humanize work if you don't know how to actually do it. On the positive side, I was also very positive, surprised about the shining examples, about those leaders who are actually doing exactly what I'm saying, or like part of it in a very innovative way, very dedicated to like thinking about this human aspect of work. And the book talks a lot about those examples, the shining example, the positive examples that were surprising to me in a really inspiring way. And I hope by sharing them in the book, others will also be inspired and think like, oh, that's cool. I mean, I can implement this in my team or my organization as well.
What is the one key takeaway you hope readers will gain from the employee advantage? Though they might reading your book in the future as soon
Yeah,
as it will be available in the market. But
yeah.
if anything you want to share, please.
Yeah. I mean, my key takeaway is like, the future of work is really human centric. If leaders internalize the insight from behavioral economics about, or what I share here about human motivation, and use it to humanize work, employees will win and businesses will thrive as well. That also then means that we're using technology to enhance human motivation and not destroy it.
Are there any final thoughts or advice you would like to share with our listeners, particularly those in a leadership positions?
Yeah. So on the one hand, the leadership job is going to be more challenging. I'm not lying about that, because leaders then have to be very intentional about their style, how to take a core motivation of the team members into account to create the employee advantage. They have to collect feedback and adjust their approach constantly. So on one hand, it's going to be harder, but I believe it's going to be a very, very rewarding journey that puts humans first. The leaders will learn about the motivation, and as a result, we'll really see significant improvements in their team performance.
Though I have added the link of your book on Amazon and other leading online platforms, but where can our listeners find your book, and how can they stay updated with your latest research and work?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Deepak. So obviously you can pre-order it and all those platforms, as you mentioned, and I really believe that any leaders on any level will benefit from the frameworks, the research and the case studies that I provide. There is another way of engaging. I have a monthly newsletter that I send out, and where I might talk about concepts of the book, but also like not just about the book, like more broadly about how to create a human-centric future of work. You can go to my webpage, stephanmeier.com. There is a bunch of resources there, including where you can sign up for the newsletter. I'm also making for each of some of the concept, I make stop motion Lego movies that go with the concept. So every month, when I send out this newsletter, there is a new video that has like a little Lego movie that shows some of the concepts, ideas in the book in a obviously much more fun, lighthearted way, that to signal that we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously sometimes, and like work should be fun as well.
Thank you, Professor Stephan, for being our guest on today's podcast episode. The practical applications of your research are truly game-changing, and you have made complex concepts both accessible and understandable. Once again, thank you for joining us on our research-based podcast channel. We are eagerly anticipating the release of the Employee Advantage and look forward to reading it as soon as it becomes available in the Indian market.
Thank you so much, Deepak. It was a real pleasure to have a conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.